At 11 that night, my husband's daughter handed me a list of rules and told me I should be grateful for the chance to serve her. She thought moving into our home meant she had finally taken control of her father. What she did not know was that I had already seen the hurt behind her cruelty, and I was not going to fight her with anger. I was going to give her something she had not expected: patience. The first thing I noticed when Emily entered our house was not the luggage or even the late hour. It was her expression. She looked worn down, almost hollow, as though she had been angry for so many years that anger had become part of her face. Her husband Brian followed behind her with 2 enormous suitcases and apologized for arriving so late. Emily did not apologize at all. Instead, she pulled a folded paper from her purse and placed it in my hand. I opened it and found a schedule that included breakfast before 6, fresh sheets every week, nightly bathroom cleaning, hand washing her delicate clothes, and several other demands. Then she looked straight at me and said I was living comfortably because of her father, so I should contribute by taking care of them. Brian looked embarrassed, while I simply folded the paper and said the guest room was ready. She seemed almost disappointed by my reaction. I could tell she had expected tears, an argument, or a complaint to her father. Instead, I carried on with the evening as though nothing unusual had happened. Once their bedroom door closed, I stood alone in the hallway and wondered what kind of pain could make someone treat kindness like a threat. I had learned a long time ago that wounded people sometimes attack the safest person nearby. The next morning, I woke before 5 out of habit and prepared breakfast before anyone else came downstairs. I made eggs, fruit, toast, sausage, coffee for Richard, and tea for myself. I also remembered that Emily was allergic to peanuts, something Richard had mentioned years earlier. When she noticed there was no peanut butter, she looked surprised that I knew. I simply told her that I remembered. After breakfast, I handled the laundry and household chores without turning them into a battle. Some clothing went into the washer, while delicate pieces were washed by hand because that actually made sense. I refused to become Emily's servant, but I also refused to deliberately make her life difficult. Later, I changed into a simple blue dress and joined Richard on the back porch. He brought my tea, sat beside me and began discussing one of the books we had been reading together. Watching Richard laugh with me from behind the kitchen window, Emily seemed confused. She had apparently expected her father to become distant after marrying me, yet he looked relaxed and genuinely happy. What she could not see from that window was that our relationship had never been built around his money. We had found each other through books, charity work, and quiet conversations long before either of us imagined marriage. Before Richard, I had built a peaceful life for myself in Charlotte. I worked at the public library, volunteered with children, and helped prepare meals for a local home. I was not searching for a wealthy husband or someone to rescue me. Richard first caught my attention because he regularly sat in the library reading old novels. We eventually discovered each other at community events, where both of us seemed more interested in helping people than impressing anyone. Our first dinner was nothing luxurious. We ate barbecue at a small restaurant, talked for hours, and laughed about how strange it felt to start dating again later in life. Richard eventually admitted that he had spent years believing he was too old to find companionship again. He told me that being alone and being peaceful were not always the same thing. That conversation became the beginning of something neither of us had planned. But Richard carried one deep regret into our marriage. His first wife, Linda, had died when Emily was 15. Richard responded to the loss by working harder and building his company, believing financial security could somehow make up for his absence. Instead, Emily grew up feeling abandoned. Richard later admitted that he had missed important parts of her childhood while convincing himself that he was providing everything she needed. He loved her, but he had never learned how to reach her. When Emily and Brian suddenly experienced financial problems, Richard immediately offered them a place to stay. Brian had lost his job, while Emily had lost several major clients in her design business. Their debts had become difficult to manage, and moving in seemed like the practical solution. Brian was uncomfortable with the arrangement, but Emily insisted that she wanted to be closer to her father. I believed her. I just did not realize how much resentment she was bringing with her. The first weeks were filled with small tests. Emily would demand things, criticize how I handled chores, and look for evidence that I was pretending to be kind. One afternoon she handed me a pile of clothes and reminded me that everything needed to be washed by hand. I separated the delicate pieces and explained that cotton shirts belonged in the washing machine. She stared at me as though I had broken one of her rules. I smiled and told her common sense mattered too. Over time, Emily discovered that I was not changing my behavior depending on who was watching. I continued working at the library, volunteering with children, and helping at the community home. I did not perform kindness for Richard, it was simply how I lived. That seemed to confuse her more than anything else. She had expected to find a selfish woman hiding behind a wealthy husband's lifestyle, but there was no secret version of me for her to expose. One weekend, Brian misplaced his wallet after working outside. He became frantic because it contained his cards and cash. I remembered finding it near the driveway earlier and had placed it safely beside the front door. When I returned it, he checked everything and realized I had not touched a single thing. Emily watched silently. I could see something change in her expression, although she was not ready to admit it. That evening, Richard asked whether Emily had hurt me with her behavior. I told him I did not see her as an enemy. I saw someone frightened and defensive. I compared her to a frightened animal that makes itself look dangerous because it is afraid of being hurt again. Richard became quiet and admitted that he might have created some of that wound by being absent when she needed him most. I reminded him that regret could not change the past, but love could still change what came next. Neither of us realized Emily was standing near an upstairs window and had heard enough to understand what we were saying. She did not confront us, instead, she became quieter. The insults became less frequent, and her suspicions slowly turned into observation. She seemed to be studying me, perhaps trying to determine whether I really meant everything I said. I gave her space because people do not heal simply because someone tells them they should. One afternoon, Emily was sitting alone in the kitchen after another difficult day with her struggling business. I noticed she had already had several cups of coffee, so I quietly made her chamomile tea. She asked why I had done it when she had not requested anything. I told her that I had noticed she usually got headaches after too much coffee. She stared at me, then quietly said thank you. It was only one word, but it felt like the first door opening. A few days later, Brian apologized for judging me. He admitted that he had once believed Emily might be right about my motives and wondered whether I had married Richard because his life was easier. I told him my life had already been good before Richard. I had chosen him because I loved him, not because I needed his money. Brian looked relieved, and when Richard later joined us, the three of us laughed together like a family that had finally begun finding its balance. Then, without warning, everything changed. Richard was outside trimming the rose bushes when Brian suddenly shouted for help. I ran into the backyard and found Richard sitting on the ground, one hand pressed against his chest. His face was pale, and his breathing had become difficult. Emily stood nearby completely frozen, staring at her father as though the years of anger had vanished in an instant. She suddenly looked 15 again. Not like the grown woman who had entered our house demanding control. Brian called emergency services while I knelt beside Richard and held his hand. Emily finally moved and grabbed her father's other hand. She was crying now, telling him she was there and that he needed to stay with her. Richard tried to speak, but the pain made it difficult. In that moment, Emily understood something no argument could have taught her. Her father was not an endless source of money, security, or second chances. He was a human being she could still lose. Richard survived the attack after receiving immediate medical treatment, but the experience changed our family permanently. Emily stopped treating me like an intruder and began treating me like someone who genuinely belonged beside her father. She eventually admitted that the rules had never really been about cleaning or laundry. They were about proving whether I would abandon her the way she believed everyone eventually did. I told her I could not erase her childhood, but I could choose how I treated her now. Months later, Emily apologized for that first night. She said she had been angry at me because it was easier than admitting how much she missed her father. I told her she did not need to be ashamed of having complicated feelings. What mattered was what she chose to do with them. She hugged me for the first time, and I realized that the woman who had once handed me a list of household rules was finally allowing herself to become part of the family. I never became Emily's servant, and she never became the perfect daughter overnight. We still disagreed sometimes, and there were moments when old habits returned. But now we talked instead of attacking each other. Richard spent more time with his daughter, Brian rebuilt his career, and our home slowly became something none of us had expected. It was not perfect, it was simply real. Looking back, I understand that the list Emily gave me that night was never really a list of chores. It was a test written by someone who was terrified of being replaced. She thought she needed to make me smaller to protect her place in her father's life. Instead, I showed her that love does not require someone else to lose. Sometimes the strongest way to change a family is not by winning a battle, but by refusing to fight one that never needed to happen.